Hey everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. It is Monday, November the 23rd, and we are 3 days away from your Thanksgiving break. As we get into today's reading, I first want to recall what happened at the end of the chapter 12 bit with Huck Finn, because we saw both him and Jim have pretty much the worst luck ever as the raft drifts away, and they're trapped on this steamboat with murderers, right? So of course Jim's in a real hard spot because he wanted Huck to leave in the first place, and Huck said, "Nah, I need a good adventure like Tom Sawyer." So we discussed in class, and for those of y'all that are at home, think about who Huck's greatest influences are. Does Jim have any influence over Huck? Maybe a little, maybe not so much. You've got to make that determination and see if you can find that answer here in the text. The next thing we discussed was morals. These robbers are talking how immoral it would have been to have shot this man that they've decided has done them wrong. But then they come to terms with the fact that it might be okay to just leave him tied up and let him drown in the shipwreck. Well, you have to ask yourself, is that moral? Surely not. Well, then what about Huck's morals? What about the way he feels about things and the difference between right and wrong? Remember, he's agreed to keep Jim's secret safe, him being, of course, a runaway slave. And in the upcoming chapters, guys, we are going to see Huck kind of struggle with this idea. So let's go ahead and get into chapter 13. And as we read, continue to think about the influence and morals at play in Twain's writing. Now, for this section, guys, chapter 13, you'll see spondylix. That means money. And then remember, of course, when they are using the word truck, they're referring back to loot, money, items, things of value that they're taking. We will not be reading chapter 14 today, and then in my next video, we'll read chapter 15. All right, so let's go ahead and dig ourselves into chapter 13. Well, I catched my breath and most fainted, shut up on a wreck with such a gang as that. But it weren't no time to be sentimenterin'. We'd got to find that boat now. Had to have it for ourselves. So we went a-quaking and shaking down the starboard side, and slow work it was, too. Seemed a week before we got to the stern. No-sighted boat. Jim said he didn't believe it could go no further. So scared he hadn't hardly had strength left, he said. But I said, come on. If we get left on this wreck, we're in a fix, sure. So on we prowled again. We struck for the stern of the Texas and found it, and then scrabbled along towards the skylight, hanging from shutter to shutter, for the edge of the skylight was in the water. When we got pretty close to the cross-hall door, there was the skiff. Sure enough. I could just barely see her. I felt ever so thankful. In another second, I would have been aboard of her, but just then I heard the door opened. One of the men stuck his head out, only about a foot from me, and I thought I was gone, but he jerked in again and says, "Heave that blame lantern out of sight, Bill!" And he flung a bag of something into the boat and then got in himself and sat down. It was Packard. Then Bill, he come out and got in. Packard says in a low voice, "All ready, shove off." I couldn't hardly hang on to the shutters, I was so weak. But Bill says, "Hold on. Did you go through him?" "No, didn't you?" "No, so he's got his share of the cash yet." "Well, then, come along. No use to take truck and leave money." "Say, won't he suspicion what we're up to?" "Maybe he won't, but we gotta have it anyway. Come along." So they got out and went in. So the two robbers here, guys, they have put a bunch of their loot and stuff into their skiff and realize that the other guy's share of the money is still in his pockets. So they have to go back into the ship to go and get the money before they tug off in their boat. So we should be supposing here what Huck might be up to. Well, the door slammed to because it was on the careen side. And in a half a second, I was in the boat and Jim come tumbling after me, and I out with my knife and I cut the rope, and away we went. We didn't touch an oar, and we didn't speak nor whisper, nor hardly even breathe. We went gliding swift along, dead silent, past the tip of the paddle box and past the stern. Then in a second or two more, we was 100 yards below the wreck, and in the darkness soaked her up, every last sign of her. And we was safe, and I knowed it. When we was 300 or 400 yards downstream, we see the lantern show like a little spark on the Texas store for a second, and we knowed by that the rascals had missed their boat and was beginning to understand that they was in just as much trouble now as Jim Turner was. Then Jim manned the oars and we took out after our raft. Now was the first time I'd begun to worry about the men. I reckon I hadn't had time before. I begun to think about how dreadful it was, even for murderers, to be in such a fix. I says to myself, there ain't no telling, but I might become a murderer myself yet, and then how would I like it? And so I says to Jim, the first light we see, we'll land 100 yards below it or above it in a place where it's a good hiding place for you and the skiff. And then I'll go and fix up some kind of yarn and get somebody to go out for that gang and tell them and get them out of their scrape so they can be hung when their time comes. But that idea was a failure, for pretty soon it begun to storm again, and this time worse than ever. The rain poured down and never a light showed. Everybody in bed, I reckon. We boomed along down the river, watching for lights and watching for our raft. After a long time the rain let up, but the clouds stayed, and the lightning kept whimpering, and by, a flash showed us a big black thing ahead, floating, and we made for it. Before we continue reading, Huck just said that he was thinking about how dreadful it would be to die on that shipwreck, even if those guys were murderers and criminals. He's thinking he doesn't like the idea of being a murderer. And now think about what this is indicating about Huck and his morals, right? He knows that those guys deserve to be caught. So here he is telling Jim, you know what? Let's park the skiff. Let's get you somewhere safe. And I'm going to go get somebody to let him know there are bad guys up there on that boat. But here we are. We see the storm coming, and he's decided that might not be so good. When he says he might come to be a murderer himself yet, right? He's referring back to those guys, and if they die, that might be on his hands. Well, what do you think? When they come up upon that black thing, guys, it was the raft, and mighty glad we was to get aboard of it again. We seen a light now and away down on the right on shore, so I said I would go for it. The skiff was half full of plunder, which the gang had stole, and it was there, that the gang had stole there on the wreck. We hustled it on the raft pile, and I told Jim to float alone down and show a light when he judged she'd gone about 2 or 3 miles, and keep it burning till I come. Then I manned the oars and shoved out for the light. As I got down towards it, 3 or 4 more showed, and up on the hillside. It was a village. I closed in above the shorelight and laid my oars and floated. As I went by, I see it was a lantern. There was the lantern hanging on a jackstaff, a double-hull ferry boat. I skimmed around for a watchman, wondering whereabouts he slept, and by, I found him roosting in the bitts, forward, with his head down between his knees. I gave his shoulder 2 or 3 little shoves and begun to cry. Now, watchman here, guys, I always relate this back to the Titanic. This is somebody who's going to be roosting, looking out on the river as they travel to make sure that they don't hit anything as they're floating along. So this guy, he's the watchman on a ferry boat, and he appears to be asleep. Well, he stirred up in a kind of startlish way, but when he see it was only me, he took a good gap and stretch, and he says, "Hello, what's up?" "Well, don't cry, bub. What's the trouble?" I says, "Pap and Ma'am and Sis and..." Then I broke down. He says, "Oh, dang it now. Don't take on so. We have all of our troubles, and this'll come out all right. What's the matter with them?" Are you the watchman of the boat?" "Yes," he says, kind and pretty well satisfied like. "Well, I'm the captain and the owner and the mate and the pilot and the watchman and head deckhand, and sometimes I'm the freight and passengers. I ain't as rich as old Jim Hornback, and I can't be so blamed generous and good to every Tom, Dick, and Harry as what he is, and slam around money the way he does. But I've told him many a time it wouldn't trade places with him. For, says I, a sailor's life is the life for me, and I'm derned if I'd live 2 mile out of town where there ain't nothing ever going on, not for all the spondulics and much more on top of it." Says I broke in and says, "They're in an awful peck of trouble, and..." "Who is?" Why, Papa, Mam, and Sis, and Miss Hooker, and if you'd like to take your ferry boat up and go up there, up where? Where are they? On the wreck. What wreck? Why, there ain't but one. What you mean? The Walter Scott? Yes. Good land, what are they doing up there, for gracious sakes? Well, they didn't go there on purpose. I bet they didn't. Why, great goodness. There ain't no chance for 'em if they don't get off mighty quick. Why, how in the nation they ever get into such a scrape? Easy enough. Miss Hooker was a visiting up there to the town. Yes, Booth's Landing. Go on. She was visiting there at Booth's Landing, and just in the edge of the evening, she started over with a woman in the house fairy to stay there all night at her friend's house. Well, Miss What-you-may-call-her, I disremember her name, and they lost steering oar and swung around and went a-floating down, stern first about 2 mile, and saddlebags down the wreck. And the ferryman and the woman and the horses, they was all lost. But Miss Hooker, she made a grab and got aboard of the wreck. Well, about an hour after dark, we come along down in our trading scow, and it was dark, and we didn't notice the wreck until we was right on it. And so we saddlebagged. But all of us was saved by Bill Whipple, and oh, he was the best creetur. I most wished it had been me, I do. My George, it's the beatin'est thing I ever struck, and then what did y'all do? So as Huck continues on his story, guys, consider how hooked this watchman is, this ferry boat owner. He seems to be very into Huck's story. And his story is talking about how he's making up, of course, he's got his mom, his dad, and another lady, and they're floating on down the river when they get saddlebagged on the boat, meaning they get caught up on the boat. They get attached to the wreck. He says that this other woman is the only survivor of the initial wreck, right? That she got saddlebagged and her horses and her slave, they fell overboard. Well, she climbed upon the wreck so that when he and his mother and his father come up on the wreck, well, they also got saddlebagged and stuck, and they saw that Miss Hooker was in a lot of trouble. So he's making up a real good story here, and this guy's buying every bit of it. Well, we hollered and took on, but it was so wide there, we couldn't make nobody hear. So Pap said somebody got to get ashore and gets help somehow. And I was the only one that could swim, so I made a dash for it. And Miss Hooker said that if I didn't strike help sooner, come here and hunt up her uncle, and he'd fix the thing. I made land about a mile below and been fooling along ever since, trying to get people to do something. But they said, what, in such a night and such a current? There ain't no sense in it. Go for the stern ferry. But now if you'll go and, by Jackson, I'd like to, and blame it if I don't know I will, but who in the dignation's going to pay for it? Do you reckon your Pap? Why, that's all right. Miss Hooker, she told me particular that her Uncle Hornback, you've heard this name before, right? Just previously on the last page, he was talking about Hornback being a ferry owner that has tons of money. Great guns, is he her uncle? Looky here, if you break for that light over yonder way and turn out west when you get there about a quarter of a mile, out you'll come into the tavern. Tell him to dart out and find Jim Hornbacks, and he'll foot the bill. And don't you fool around any, because he'll want to know the news. Tell him I'll have his niece all safe before he can get to town. Now hump yourself now. I'm a-going up to the corner. Gotta roust out my engineer. Well, I struck out for the light, but as soon as he turned the corner, I went back and got into my skiff and bailed her out and then pulled ashore easy water about 600 yards and tucked myself in among the wood boats. For I couldn't rest easy until I could see the ferry boat start. But, take it all around, I was feeling rather comfortable on accounts of taking all this trouble for that gang, for not many would have done it. I wish the widow knowed about it. I judge she would be proud of me for helping these rapscallions, because rapscallions and deadbeats is the kind of the widow and good people takes the most interest in. Now, here we should consider the widow's influence. Huck's learned enough goodness from the widow to recognize that him helping out even the bad guys is a good deed. He's got strong morals. But I'm also considering the fact that Huck has lied to this poor old other ferry boat owner who's going to be risking himself and his boat to go and find these bad guys, if you will. And he's expecting he's going to be paid for his trouble, and there's not going to be any money in it for him. So, yeah, he's making a good choice by trying to save these bad guys from this sinking ship. But what about the other ferry boat owner and him not getting paid? I have to consider the losses that he faces as well. Well, before long, here comes the wreck, dim and dusky, sliding along down. A kind of cold shiver went through me, and then I struck out for her. She was very deep, and I see in a minute there weren't much chance for anybody being alive in her. I pulled all around her and hollered a little, but there weren't any answer. All dead still. I felt a little bit heavy-hearted about the gang, but not much, for I reckoned if they could stand it, I could. So he watched the wreck tumble down into the water, and he's figuring that nobody's alive. Well, then here comes the ferry boat. So I shoved for the middle of the river down a long stream slant, and I judged I was out of eye reach. I laid in my oars and looked back and see her go and smell around the wreck for Miss Hooker's remainders, because the captain would know her Uncle Hornback would want 'em. And then pretty soon the ferry boat give it up and went for shore, and I laid into my work and went a-booming down the river. It did seem a powerful long time before Jim's light showed up, and when it did show, it looked like it was 1,000 miles off. By the time I got there, the sky was beginning to get a little gray in the east, so we struck for the island and hid the raft and sunk the robbers' boats. And we turned in and slept like dead people. So again, guys, here at the end of this chapter, consider what Huck has just faced. He's gotten him and Jim safely out of that wreck and away from the robbers. They've been able to spare their own lives, but then, of course, we know that the other three, the two murderers and the guy that was tied up, they've all lost their lives. And now they've also put this other ferry boat captain at risk, and we saw his ferry boat go back up to the shore. So Huck Finn knows here that that man's going to have to deliver some bad news to some guy that doesn't exist. And Miss Hooker's not really dead because she's not really on the boat, and he's not getting paid. So as we get into chapter 14, guys, I'll lead in the next video about what chapter 14 is all about, because we are going to skip it, and I'll catch you in the next video for chapter 15.